Hi YouTube, Yucca here with my 10th guide on Java development, where we'll be focusing on methods or functions. As stated in previous tutorials, methods or functions in Java or object-oriented programming are responsible for modifying the data or the state of your Java objects, or your fields for that matter. There's different jargon used and so forth. And in the previous guide I introduced you to variables, which represent the state and the data of our objects, and between that tutorial and this one I put in some variables here to represent the data or state that we typically associate with the user class file that we're busy developing, which will be used to create user objects out of. So I started populating the class file here with some instance or local variables, which each user object, in other words each time a user is instantiated. In the previous guide I demonstrated, or we can create user objects as follows: user with a reference data type of user, and the identifier as follows: user 1 with a reference variable, and using the new keyword just to burn in the concept from the previous tutorial, and we can construct users or any objects within methods. Typically we do that, and just to verify that currently there are no errors in this code or this class file, and I'm gonna just do a print line statement here and just verify no errors, and one user created. Alright, so I'll just run this code here just to verify that there are no errors here, and see if we get any output. And yeah, here's our output: no users, no errors, and one user created. Now, getting back to this tutorial, which focuses on methods, and we're going to look at the main method because it's the sole method we've been interacting with, and it's a good method to bring around some of the concepts with regards to methods and that. Well, firstly, we put statements into methods, like with this print line statement here, which prints a message to the output or the standard output. And methods, typically within their bodies, methods have bodies, and the body is defined. Well, let's look at the whole method and understand all the keywords. Now, like with everything in Java, we have keywords which construct or form the structure of methods. So the first keyword we'll look at here is an access modifier. Access modifiers I'll get into in my next tutorial, and they're pretty complex, but for now just understand that access modifiers restrict or provide accessibility to the code on which they are placed. And access modifiers go on not just methods, but they can also go on variables. In other words, like here where I've put in a string here, I've put it as private. Now, just for the sake of this tutorial and not to confuse you, a public access modifier makes the code on which it is attached the most accessible with regards to other class files. Basically, access modifiers is pretty much related and tied down to the concept of packaging structure and in which files or directories your Java class files are located. And I'll get to this in the next tutorial. But continuing with this tutorial and methods, methods are structured as follows, and the main method is pretty unique in that it is used to launch the Java application, and in that it is structured as follows. Now, the main method has to be public. It has to be accessible by, for example, a Java class which may or may not be running on the virtual machine and may need to run your main method, and by providing the identifier or access modifier of public, we ensure that any other Java class file, not just one that may be running before your application starts on the Java virtual machine to launch your application, public ensures that this method is accessible. Now, static implies that the code on which this modifier is placed. Now, static is not an access modifier. Sometimes it's confused with an access modifier. Static implies that for each and every Java object which are created, irrespective of whether they have different state and so forth. In other words, if we create one user to represent user A and user B for a new user, static implies that the code on which it is placed is not created dynamically or individually for each user object when each user object is created. Static implies that there's only one representation of this method ever amongst all objects of a user class, whether it be 1 or 1,000,000 users. They only have one main method, and irrespective of the amount of users or the differentiation of users, the method always executes the same, and it always provides the same data if it does provide any data, but the main method doesn't. And the main method, by being static, it implies that the main method is accessible before we have an instance of at least one or several user objects up and running. And this makes sense. We don't need instances, we don't need to instantiate or to create new users to access this method, given that this method never changes. So why should we need a user object up and running when we can simply guarantee that the main method never changes, and therefore just provide direct access to the method instead of creating a new user object? And so by being public, the main method is accessible to any other Java class file located in any other directory. And given that the Java JDK and given that the virtual machine probably has a Java class file up and running that needs to access your main method, the main method is marked public, and it's also static. We don't have any objects up and running, our application hasn't started yet, but given that the method is marked static, we don't need to create objects. We can simply access the main method without having an instance of the class of which it is a member, and thus we are able to provide access to the main method by making it public and ensuring that it's static. In other words, we don't need to create an instance to access this method. The next word here, which is essential to every Java method, and within a class file we can have several methods, and typically methods would take in data, and they do so through what we refer to as arguments. Now, arguments and parameters are often confused with each other. Now, parameters are in fact what you see here between the parentheses of a method. I'm going to create a different method here just to bring about the concept. So methods typically take in data, and they do so through what is located here between the parentheses of the method. Now, the main method takes in a string array, which is a data type, and basically it is a data type which contains several strings. You can think of it as a cookie packet or a biscuit packet, where there are just biscuits of the same type, and you take out one by one and they are stored in a row one by one. The concept is pretty much the same with arrays and that, which are data types, and the main method can take in a string array of arguments which are provided when you launch your application. You can provide arguments in the form of strings, and these will be used by the main method, or at least are usable by the main method. So the next part after the static modifier remember it's not an access modifier, is void. Void indicates, or the word that goes here. Now we can either provide a data type here, in other words we can provide an integer, any reference to any object which we create. In other words, we could provide user as a valid data type here to return, but the main method is pretty unique because there are no objects up and running on the Java virtual machine. Your application hasn't even started. Now the data type that we provide here indicates that the method is going to return data to the piece of code or the client code which calls upon the main method. Now the code which launches your Java application certainly isn't expecting any data back, and so we provide a modifier of void which indicates that this method cannot and will not return any data. Now the association of a data type, which I'll just provide here, I'll just create a new method just for the sake of this tutorial. Now within a Java class file we can place several methods, and just for the sake of this tutorial I'll just place in a public method, and I'll indicate that this method can return a data type or a variable type of string, and I'm going to call the method, I'm going to give it its name, and because the method won't do anything, I'll just call the method doJunk. And with the main method, after the void, which indicates whether the method returns anything, and if it does, you specify the data type here which the method will return, and so forth. Now methods are typically responsible for taking in data, like the main method does here, interacting with the data, modifying it, and then returning it. Now the main method doesn't return any data, so it's marked here with a void keyword. And our doJunk method, which we're busy creating here, and every method has a name, so the name of this method is doJunk. Now the doJunk method, or let's call it doNothing, and so doNothing, and this method we're creating here has the name of doNothing, and the method won't do anything, and all methods have a body, and so we use parentheses, and then we provide a body to the method between, like our class files which have a body. And just to show you again, our user class file has a body. Everything located within the body of the user class file, which we'll be busy creating for these tutorials, are members of the user class file, which we'll get into in the next tutorial as well, where we'll discuss access modifiers. And so classes have bodies, constructors also have bodies. Here's our default constructor, which we created in a previous tutorial, and that has a body in which we can use to initialize variables with their state and so forth, and we'll get to that in the next tutorial possibly as well. Now getting back to method structure, so we have the access modifier, which provides or restricts accessibility to your method, and we also have the method name and the return type, which indicates which, if any, data the method is expected to return. Now any clients or any code which uses the doNothing method is bound to the application program interface, and by application program interface it is bound by the way that this method is structured. This method returns a string variable, as we indicate here, and by indicating that we are returning a string variable from this method, Now typically what this implies with regards to programming is that by indicating that this method returns a string, we can expect that the method will either take in a parameter here of a string type, and you'd specify a identifier which you'd be able to use within this block of code, and I'll provide an identifier here of modifier me, and once we have a parameter here for the method, now parameters are placed within the parentheses which come directly after the method name, and if you just give me a sec here, so we have the modify, well, do nothing method here, and it can take in a string variable, and typically we'd use that modify me variable within this method, and we could, as an example, we could assign a new variable value as follows. Now remember, we've indicated a data type here of string. A string is a literal, and we can just assign it a value as follows, and perfectly valid code. So once we've interacted with the data, which methods are largely responsible for, and in this method here we've provided through our application program interface the ability of any client code, in other words any code which makes use of the do nothing method, we've provided it the ability to provide this method with a string reference variable, and the string reference variable, which is identified by the modifier me identifier, is used within the method, and it's assigned as a literal. It's assigned a value of nothing really essential. And once we've interacted with the data, and given that methods are largely used to interact with the data and modify it, because the method indicates that the method returns something, and because the client of the do nothing method is expecting data, we provide a return keyword here, and once we've modified the data, and we can just we can return null, which is a valid data type, which indicates that the method, we don't really know the values to return, and or that there isn't a logical value to return, so we just return null from this method. We could return any string object because we've specified here that this do nothing method returns data types of string, so any string type here we could return. In fact, we could just return hello as a valid data type. Note that there are no errors here in my code, everything's in yellow, and if I run the class again, I'll get the no errors and one user created message over here, and we have two methods in this class, so I'll just modify the message in class with two methods. Right, so just to verify that there's no errors in this code, just run the code here, and see I get the message here as I've just entered, and an exit code of 0, which indicates there's no errors, and we can proceed. So to recap this tutorial, we discussed variables in our previous tutorial. I provided some variables in between these tutorials which we could typically associate with a user, which our user.java class file will be used to create objects for, and we have constructors, and we have methods which are used to interact with and modify the state which is represented by our variables in our Java applications. Now, the main focus once again of methods with the exception of the main method, is to interact with data. Now the data that the methods receive are provided through parameters. There's a confusion between parameters and arguments. Now arguments are essentially part of the method signature, and they are what you see over here and here. Arguments form part of the method signature, and they form part of the application program interface, and they bind the client or the code which calls upon this method, as an example, to provide data through what we refer to as parameters. So parameters and arguments are often associated as the same thing, but arguments form part of the actual signature and bind the client code to using the method correctly. In other words, for any client or any other code to use this do nothing method, they have to provide a string data type or a variable, and that is to use the code successfully, otherwise they won't be able to tap into this method that we've provided here. And typically the parameters, the arguments that are provided to the method through the parameters, the parameters that are provided to the method through the arguments which come from the client code are used within the method. And here we've taken the modifier me identifier, which will identify the argument which is provided, the parameter which is provided as an argument to this method, and we assign it a new value, and the method is expected to return a data type of string, and the client, which will call on this method because they are bound to the signature of the method, will need to call it expecting a string, and therefore we need to return a data type, as I've done here with a simple string literal here. I haven't constructed the string, and I haven't initialized it into a variable. At least you don't need to, and for the sake of this tutorial we don't need to. So one last thing here with regards to static, and again static implies that there's only one representation of this method, and it's accessible before we have an instance of the user.java object. And this is logical again, because firstly the main method in itself, there are no Java objects up and running at the time that the Java application starts, and therefore there are no objects to launch your user.java class file out of, or to launch your application. And by marking the main method static, we don't need an instance of the user class. It's accessible before we have any instances, which again is logical, because amongst all user objects, irrespective of 100 users, there's only one representation of the main method, as is provided here through the static. And logically we don't need a different instance, because in fact the main method is not different whether it be for user A, B, C or D, and to create an object would be unnecessary, because you'd be getting the same function or the same method irrespective of how many users we have. And should your method return nothing, you have to specify a keyword of void, which indicates that this method doesn't return anything. In fact, if we try and return a data type here of just a string, we'll see we get an error, and the compiler warns us that the value type for the method is not compatible with a void result type. So if we try and run the code here, we'll see you cannot return a value here. This is a compiler error from a return type with a method with a result type of void. So either we take away the void access modifier here, and we'll see we still get And if we type in a string here as follows, you'll see I don't get any errors here. The method is coded correctly now. The method states that it returns a string data type, and we've provided a string data return type here with the return keyword, but the main method is bound by its signature. If you want your Java application to be launched, you have to, according to the application program interface, you have to provide a void access modifier, which indicates to the object which probably is up and running on the Java virtual machine to launch your application that this is the correct method to use. It doesn't return any data, and should there be an object which launches your object on the Java virtual machine or your application, it certainly wouldn't expect any data because it wouldn't interact with any data logically that you return. And so the main method is coded specially, and you are bound to the signature as follows. It's void, it doesn't return any data, and therefore we have to remove the return here because we've indicated that the method doesn't return anything through the void word keyword, and thus we cannot return data from it. But with regards to other methods of a typical, or functions, if you're familiar with other languages, typically other methods will interact with the data which they are provided to their arguments, and the data which is provided to this method from the client which uses this method, that client will provide parameters, and in order to use this method, which we've done with the name of do nothing, the client code which calls upon this method has to provide a string parameter as that client is bound to by the argument here, which is what goes between the parentheses here. So to burn in the concept of how methods are structured, and we have our access modifier, and then we have another capable or optional modifier of static, which you don't need unless you need separation from the concept of being individual to each new object. So in other words, when you provide static, once again you're saying that there's only one representation of whatever you mark as static amongst all instances or all objects that are created, irrespective of how many. There's only one representation should you choose to provide static. Then you provide a return type, which can either be void or any other data type like an integer, and then you provide a name for the method, calculate me, and every method has parentheses, and in between the parentheses you can place in data which you typically expect to be provided for the method, and the data that you typically provide for the method would be used within the method body, which is created as follows. And because the method over here expects a return type, within the body you have to put at least at minimal a return statement, and given that this method returns an integer type of, or the data type of integer, we can return 0. And just do that for the sake of this tutorial. And the method name here is wrong. You cannot put a space between any names, and fix one more error, and the method here, sorry, I marked it as void, which means it doesn't return anything. And so yeah, the method here doesn't return any data, and basically this is the concept of methods. Methods modify the state of the Java objects, typically the objects within which they are placed. Methods can also be used to construct objects out of, and within our main method here again, I'll just place, or to instantiate, we can instantiate a user as follows: user 1 equals new user. So methods can instantiate or construct other objects, and once they've constructed other objects, they can call upon other objects, methods and variables, and with the restriction of access modifiers, and I'll get into access modifiers in my next tutorial. And pretty much this tutorial sums up methods and functions which typically modify the state or the data which are represented by variables, as done in my previous tutorial I demonstrated, and they can also receive data through the application program interface through the arguments which are provided as signature of the method. They can accept data, and typically the responsibility of methods is to modify data, and once they've modified or interacted with the data, we can choose to return the modified data through a return statement. And once we provide a return statement, we have to provide a data type return value here just before the method name, which indicates the data type that the client of the method will receive. And when we specify void, it indicates that the method cannot and will not return any data type. And that's my 10th tutorial on Java development. In the next tutorial I'll discuss access modifiers. Thank you for watching.